All right, scaling for planned events. One of the things whenever Robert Treat, who's my boss now, asked me about speaking, was there anything you wanted to speak about? I actually talked to him about this. He was like, well, tell me something that you did at your last job you thought, that everyone thought would be easy but wasn't. And one of the interesting things is that in news, entertainment, and sports, which is kind of the background that I was in and for web and everything, you can think about a sports team pretty much has a schedule that comes out. Everyone knows when the big game is that happens in January, for professional football and all that sort of stuff, so everyone knows when that's happening. You know it every year when it's happening. You know when every presidential election is. So it's got to be easy, right? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. A little bit about me. Like I say, I'm currently now with OmniTI. That's my title. It sounds far more exciting than what I actually do. Before I came to OmniTI, I've only been in OmniTI for about 3 months now. I worked for Turner Broadcasting for quite a while. And at Turner Broadcasting, I had several jobs. One of the jobs I was a senior ops guy for all the digital web properties. And that included things like pretty much all the Turner brands that you know, as well as third-party things, and that was NBA, NASCAR, NCAA, and actually HBO for a time, which there's actually something about that in here. I'm an old school C guy. I actually do a lot of Go nowadays, which is interesting, I suppose. But I've ran ops groups, I've ran dev groups, I've ran cables, I've racked and stacked things, I've met with CTOs and CEOs, so I've done a little bit of everything. I live in Atlanta, Georgia with my wife and 4 kids, and it's actually my son's birthday today, so my youngest, he turned 7 today, so I'm missing that, I guess. So, okay, what is a planned event? For the kind of purpose of this talk, it's an event on an existing site. We're not talking about a planned new site launch or even a site relaunch, although those type of things could be similar. The biggest thing about a planned event is it's generally not something that's driven by the website. For example, if you're launching a new feature on a shopping site, it's kind of on your schedule and everything. Planned events have something happening in the quote-unquote real world, and you can't change the date. Like if a certain large news site isn't ready for an election to happen, elections committee just doesn't care. It's going to happen anyway. The basketball playoffs are going to happen whether you want them to or not, if you're ready with that new feature or not. Say it could be a single event but is planned and known in advance. For a new product launch, I don't mean like on the website, but a news or sports event may know about a sponsorship deal coming up, and they're going to do this kind of on-web event around that. So it could be a single thing. And some of these are known, they have a repeating pattern of weeks, and some of them are years. Think about a presidential election, every 4 years it's going to come around. And if you think about some sites, you only ever really think about them for this event. If you think about it, no one cares about certain basketball sites until the playoffs are around, for example. So a lot of these sites live and breathe by these events. It's kind of like Black Friday for retailers, in that every year, that one time a year, whenever they have their single event, some sites will get literally 80% of their traffic for an entire year in a single day. And it's planned, not a breaking news event, or hey, someone shared this on Reddit or something silly like that. And that's that. And there's sometimes the entire department's budget, which includes real people with real jobs and everything, is tied to that one day. So, and like I said, most of my experience is around political, sports, and entertainment events, but I can imagine kind of retail has a similar feel to it if you're doing that online. Okay, in the ideal situation, an event is just another day at work, right? You're going to handle this. You already have all your scaling worked out. The site is awesome. You're just going to turn a few dials, and everyone's going to sit around and do nothing because you've known about this for 4 years, right, on an election, or you knew about it for a year. And you have enough testing to do, time to do your traffic model so that you make sure, so you can notify your third parties and all of that. And you also have someone who knows how to plan for organic growth involved and all that. The unfortunate reality of that, and a lot of this will come out of the company that I was at, which was a little, dysfunctional is not the word, but there were a lot of competing business interests. For example, kind of all those sites that I named, each one of them thought they were the most important site in the world. And I'm sure everyone thinks their site is the most important site in the world. But whenever you happen to be in an ops group that supports 20 sites that think they're the most important site in the world, you get pulled in different directions. But the interesting thing is a lot of these business units, their event operations, if you will, and oftentimes, and I mean kind of business operations, is completely separate from their day-to-day operations. Some of them have different ad sales teams for events because a lot of time they sell it as two different brands. Like, hey, you can, because no one cares about D3 women's lacrosse, but someone does. But how about advertisers generally do not care about, but they really, really care about this madness that happens every March. And so they actually run that as kind of two different brands, but it's all on the same website. So you get these competing business interests actually from within the same larger business unit. And an interesting thing from kind of a purely operations standpoint is that quite easily, you get 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more traffic during an event than they do at any other time of the year. Like say, during that month of madness, a particular site, like I said, it gets about 80% of its traffic in 6 hours. 3 hours on one day, 3 hours on the other for the entire site. So, which is interesting. And another thing, it tends to be the longer you have to prepare for an event, the more that people put it off. It's like, oh, I could get to that. I know that's not till March. That's not till November. Even whenever the business team may be like, no, it's really important to us. But and even as an ops guy, like, hey, we really got to get those things racked. And everyone's like, I've got a week to do that. It's not going to matter. But then you start stacking those up, and the next thing you know, the event is a month away, and you've done absolutely no preparation. And oftentimes, the longer that you have, the more ideas that people start having. And so a lot of times you actually get these events that are happening. It says, we should really launch that new site in coordination with that event. Or we have this awesome new feature we've been thinking about doing. I know that we should do that for this event. And so it turned into a mini or sometimes a full site relaunch in addition to planning for everything else. And another thing is, kind of using a retail analogy, I guess, you can't really, well, I guess you could, but it was, for like, imagine a Black Friday sale or something, you can't really put it up on Thursday and have people test it out in real life. You can't do A/B testing on election results before the election happens. It'd be really awesome if you could. So in a lot of these things, you can do as much simulation as you want, but as far as real world actual getting people on a website and using the features that you've done, you can't really do that until the event actually happens. And as we all know, things in the lab, no matter how careful you craft your test, do not behave the same way they do in real life. Latencies, et cetera. People tend to not do what you think they're going to do on a website as well. Something about that. And every time this comes up, actually someone asked me today, it's like, why don't you just cache everything whenever you have these sites? Well, one of the problems with this is that oftentimes current caching, or when these sites were launching, things like caching dynamic content, that our Platinum sponsor Fastly does, just didn't exist. So we had fairly complex custom caching things that we used, either Everything from, custom varnish stuff to some custom things that we had done in Nginx to do all these crazy things. But the thing is like a lot of these sites, let's be honest, 11 and a half months of the year, no one really cared. If you only got, a couple of hundred requests per second, there's no real reason to put a lot of work into caching that. And then by the time it comes around, to the event, everyone's like freaking out and everything, but it's like, oh, that's not part of the timeline, et cetera. And, like I said, I had 19 other sites, begging our group for things. And since the site was able to run, 11 and a half months out of the year in this dynamic mode, they're like, oh, you guys figure out how should that work. And another interesting thing is generally the problem with a lot of these events were not necessarily the actual, what we think about the flat HTML or whatever. On a lot of these sites, it did turn out that you could cache that, or people were willing to live with a cache. It was a lot of times the services around it. What good is it in a lot of ways if we have that really awesome basketball site if no one can see ads? Because, if you ask the ad salespeople, if you don't have ads on the site is down. I don't care if you can see it or not, because they have, quotas that they have to meet, so many things. So a lot of those things you can't, obviously you can't cache that, and or if you're doing some kind of authentication, et cetera. Feature creep was often a problem. At least in the sports and entertainment world, features, they generally tried to sell them. Speaking of ad salespeople, like, we really want a widget that does this, and we're willing to pay you this much money. And in general, the business, it could be the worst idea ever, but they're willing to take money for it. And in general, they vastly underestimate the amount of effort that it would take to do it. Oh yeah, we'll just do this, and then you turn around and realize that the deal wasn't actually signed until 2 weeks before the event was going to take place, and obviously you can't actually work on the feature until you know you're going to get paid for it. And not only that, if it doesn't perform on the site, then they're not going to pay you, or they're going to hassle you and drag it out for months at a time and get lawyers involved and everything. And then you always had these interrupts that features then had to compete with the normal, like getting the site ready for the event. So you'd have development teams that would, literally day to day have to change their priorities. One of the things that we did and like to do ahead of time was to do the degradation plan. And what that meant is, depending on the site or whatever, no matter how well you've done it and everything, something bad's probably going to happen. We underestimated the traffic. It turns out that the latency on something was not what we thought it was. So we always found it very useful to have it done, that degradation planning done ahead of time, so much so that you actually had a playbook that we would literally say, if latency on this service goes above 500 milliseconds, we will remove that feature from the site. And we actually had, sometimes they were printed up and everything, because they had to be signed off by someone from the business, because from an operations perspective, or even a developer, to me, it's like ads are slow, so take them off the site. Makes sense, right? And obviously the business, we're like, yeah, we can't do that because we have, goals that we have to reach. So you have to have a sit down, and everyone needs to discuss, what features are actually the most important, but at the same time, which ones are actually most impactful to the site's performance. Because, changing, font size obviously is just not going to help during whenever you're having performance issues. But then again, it was generally, the business was very willing to give up very easy things, like we'll let you go from 12 to 10 images. It's like, dude, that's not going to help. It was like, we really need impactful things like that dynamic widget counter up there that no one ever uses. That's what we actually want to remove first. So, but the thing is, and there was a lot of back and forth and everything on that, but the thing was at the end of this, before the event, you actually had written, everyone had agreed to it, literally with signatures and everything, because a lot of times, like I said, there was a lot of money involved in this, so that planning would have to be signed off, so that the day that the event happened, there was just no thinking about that. If this happens, we do this. So if the widget counter disappeared from the site, nobody in the business would freak out. The developers wouldn't be getting calls. The ops people, would not have to do heroic efforts to get it back on the site. And and one of the ways that we would do that is just like you would do on a normal site, is make sure that we baked into as much as possible feature flags, like widget counter on, widget counter off. And another thing that we actually did was we had, for each event, we had someone that was the benevolent dictator. What that meant was that person was the final say on all decisions that made with site health. And a lot of times it was actually not a technical person, which was interesting, because what that did was kind of, the buck had to stop somewhere. A lot of times it was someone from the business or someone from us. So if that person said do this, we just did it. Obviously, it had to be someone that was informed about the business needs, et cetera, because no matter what you all put into the playbook, there was always something that was going to come up that you weren't expecting. Like, what happens if China DDoSes our site during this event? And they can make the call on that. And they don't have to know everything. Because in that case, someone from the security team would come and says, "I think you should just black hole China." And that person say, "Yes, let's do that." But that way it was not drawn out, and that person had to have a good team to rely on, and which meant that everyone kind of had to do their job. Dependencies, this is actually where we got bit mostly, was that most sites are no longer just that flat web page and maybe a couple of images or whatever. That most sites, like websites, have gotten so large, and the dependency trees looks kind of like a bowl of spaghetti now, that no single individual or sometimes even an entire department could keep, the site in their head, so to speak. It may be documented, but there's no way that you could, kind of visualize in your head all the dependencies and interdependencies and everything, particularly whenever third parties were involved, and then you had these indirect dependencies that you didn't know about, that this service actually, that you depend on, actually calls out to this other service that you don't even know about. And we would actually have that even with internal services that we were written, because another business unit perhaps may have ran that service. Another good thing that we found that's probably a good idea is if you're about to dump 1,000 times more traffic than normal on a third party, you might want to give them a heads up. We actually had that happen, that someone didn't tell one of their third parties that an event was coming up, and we cratered them. And a lot of times, they may just say, "Yeah, we can't do that, take us off your site during the event," or something like that. Or we've actually had them just not believe us when we say, "No, really, this site that does 4 hits a second is going to get 4 million hits in an hour." I'm like, yeah, and then they went down. Operations during an event, because as you can imagine, during these events it is fairly chaotic, particularly with all the systems or whatever. We would actually have physical as well as virtual war rooms, and virtual would just be IRC, HipChat, or Slack, or something like that, but we would actually physically sit someone from each team in a room, and they would sit in there with that benevolent dictator that I mentioned earlier, and there was usually a representative from the business if that was not the dictator, so to speak. And what that allowed us to do was just actually see people and have the side conversations without it being on a phone, which doesn't work, or being in a chat room, which generally works okay, but it's for certain types of communication. But so we would actually do that. And the interesting thing is, like, if you ever do this, like, bring food in for people, because if right during an event you realize that no one's eating lunch and it's 4 p.m., it's kind of not a good way to do that. So those are some interesting things. Another thing that we found is to keep your actual chat room where the real technical problem solving goes on, or chat rooms, and the one that like your VPs and EVPs and all that sit in, not be the same chat room. No matter how much they ask, we would lie to them and say that, "Oh yeah, this is the chat room we're using for operations." Because there's a lot of, I guess you'd say, sausage making going on during these events. And not only that, things can get quite heated, as you can imagine, during those, and lots of F-bombs, whenever you don't quite know your CEO is listening in on that, is generally not good. Like after the event, always do a post-mortem, whether it was good or bad. Even if you performed excellent, like just do that. It gives, in our experiences, it gave everyone, not on the team, just on the team, good exposure to what actually happened and how things ran, but also it was useful for kind of, you know, showing the rest of the company what it was that you actually did. So we would actually have big meetings and, you know, like invite, you know, all the different department heads and all that so they could come see it. You know, even the bad ones, you know, we would do that. Another thing, depending on the system you're using to collect all your metrics, like if you were, a lot of them tend to age out metrics. And so if you only keep metrics around for a year, or you only keep them around with any sort of, you know, time in them for a year, and you have an event that only happens every 2 years, it's not terribly useful 2 years from there. Either that or like having 1 hour time intervals is not terribly useful 6 months after an event because, oh, we got a hit, you know, so. Okay, like I said, I'm just going fast. Couple of few of examples. Like I say, the name's been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty, and any brand name that I may slip up and say is used for examples only in completely fictitious way. And I've got another couple, but one that I thought about after I did my slides, I made it myself a note. And this was one of those that, you know, we didn't believe the business when they told us this, so, you know, much less anyway. There's a certain network that shows primarily cartoons. They had an event, and it was one of these, hey, on this day and this, you know, and they move fairly quickly if you think about kind of the cycle of products there. You know, in a month, we're going to have this thing, we're going to tell these kids to go to the website during commercial break and get this code and enter it into this other website. It was kind of this cross-promotional thing or whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great or whatever. And it was going to be like every Tuesday for a month or something like that. So the first time we did that or whatever, sure enough, you know, someone sitting there was like, did that website that serves mostly cartoons.com just go down? So I was like, what time is it? Oh, it's, you know, the first commercial break of that. And sure enough, literally kids will do what websites tell them to do. And so having to, you know, kind of, you know, come clean and says, normal site scaling didn't handle it like we thought we would. You know, our models were off because it turns out that the business was even low in their traffic estimates, which generally never happens. They're always, you know, overly exaggerated. And so the next Tuesday rolled around or whatever it was, and we were all, you know, had built up and fixed what was broken or whatever. And you could literally sit there, you know, television here, you know, having your monitors going on here, commercial start, and it was just, you know, straight up. So that was kind of an interesting one. And then, but the nice thing is, the unfortunate thing is because we screwed up the first one, every single time that one of those happened, then we all had to sit there and watch freaking cartoons, you know. Whenever you could have been doing something else, and perhaps if we'd have handled the first one right, we could have just, you know, threw a couple of people in a room with one of the business people, and they would have been happy. Oops. So an easy one. There's a large sports site that has some madness that goes on once a year. It happens to be using a PHP platform, and I'm not particularly picking on PHP. I would pick on the platform. I won't name it. But it has a droplet as its logo. It's just, you can make performance sites, but you can also, out of that framework, but you can also make some that are extremely, extremely horrible. But this happens to be one of those websites, like I said, that they get hundreds of requests per second during normal, you know, day-to-day, because, you know, they actually, none of the popular sports outside of basketball, they don't have rights to. So, you know, the actual most popular college sport is actually football, but they don't have rights to that, which is odd considering who that is. But college sports are weird. But so they have a once a year event, but they also have this thing that one time, like, you know, that probably no one who works there now, you know, was actually working there. One time that they had something stuck in cache, therefore caching is bad. You know, you just can't do cache because, remember that one time? And also they, the system was kind of an interesting hack on that framework. And so if we threw a cache up in front of it, you would actually get the thing that if the cache, if it was just straight TTL based, as soon as something dropped out of cache, the site would crater because caches would come back to it and you'd get this thundering herd effect. So what we wound up having to do with that was just jack up the TTL extremely high, and then whenever they actually wanted to publish something, we would actually have to go poke the cache. It'd been nice. This was before certain other products were out in the market or whatever, so we kind of had to do all this ourselves, which was interesting. But the nice thing about this is that it actually worked. You know, we actually got business buy-in. It's like, you can either do it this way or we need to buy 1 million machines or whatever it was. At the time, it was some, if you did the calculations with that, so it was just some obscene number and you needed 4 years to even do it because it was a single database and all that sort of stuff. Obama's first presidential inauguration happened during the day, which also has an effect on how large events are on certain websites, because if people are at home, particularly for news and sporting events, they tend to watch it on television. So you actually get a, you know, kind of the bump that you get from one of those events is not terribly much. But this was, at least at the time, I think this was predicted to be and wound up being the largest, you know, video event on the internet ever. So just say that legacy video delivery services were very expensive. I won't name any names. And it wasn't just that they were expensive, but if you were going to say, like, you know, be a good guy, give them that heads up, say, hey, we're going to probably do 1 million, you know, to 1.5 million video streams on this day, you know, which now doesn't seem like that much, but back then it did. They would be like, no. You know, you have to give us X months and all this sort of stuff. And then it turns out, since, you know, there were those legacy video delivery services, there weren't too many of them. It turns out that pretty much every other news organization in the world had called them and told them the same thing. So what they actually would do is you effectively had to reserve so many streams. Like, you know, we think we're going to do 1 million, and it wound up, and it was extremely expensive to do that. But what we didn't want to happen for the user experience was, I want to go watch the video of the inauguration, and it turns out that people all say that, but this is still the way I kind of feel about whenever I go to a news article and it's actually only video. You watch it for about 30 seconds and turn it off because, you know, there's only so much, and really the inauguration is all about the swearing in and everything around that. It's just pomp. But so we came up with a system which is called the waiting room, as you see there. And what it would do is because they had an API call on this video service, like, hey, how many streams am I actually using? Because if you had 1 million reserved, for example, and you could probably do more than that or whatever, but they didn't guarantee it. It was like you got into, your SLA was for 1 million, and not only would it slow down for that, you know, 1 million in first person, everybody else would get screwed as well. So to basically gauge that or whatever, you know, it hit us, says, oh, you've got 900,000. Okay, let them in. You know, we had a waiting room, which was basically click, and if you hit that API and it says, no, there's 1 million or whatever in there, we would do something to distract the user. And the nice thing is you didn't have to distract them for very long, because it turns out the people actually only watched the video for about 30 seconds to a minute going on. So give them a survey, show them an article, make them click something else, you know, around just to distract the user. So that was actually one of those event planning things, and kind of a useful hack in a lot of ways that we did to get around that. The nice thing is in video services, since there are competitors and all that, is in general what we would do then is actually have multiple providers and all that, and you could really piss someone off and says, well, we're just not going to put any traffic on you. So there are actually other advantages to having more than one. A really horrible day in my life was the 2008 election, which it turns out that if everyone can think back into the dark ages of 2008, what kind of are around that time, but what mobile web was, it's not what it was today. You know, there was still, you remember that? What was it? WAP and all of that stuff. It was horrible. But the thing is, like, no one the mobile website was always an afterthought. Like you had your main site that you poured all your money and everything into. And in general, what most of the sites did the businesses chose to do was they would just outsource it because they get very little traffic on them, hard to sell ads to it because everyone's on crap phones and all that. And so this major news site was mobile site was outsourced to this third party, and we worked closely with them to do server capacity planning and all that. And you basically we think we're going to get this much traffic, and based on mobile and mobile growth and that sort of stuff, you're going to get 8% of the traffic is going to be mobile or whatever it was, And this says, oh, just to be safe, we'll test up to double that on their systems. So third party does all the testing on the servers. We're great and all that. And then immediately as the election results start coming in, the mobile site went down. And it was actually one of those interesting failure types, is it turns out that no one uses mobile in 2008 except to get elections results. So it turned out to not be 8% or whatever it was. It turned out to be, more like 20%. And an interesting thing is it turned out that a third party, and I've probably done something even worse than this, they tested the hell out of the servers or whatever, but they never actually tested if they had enough bandwidth to serve. So it turns out to be that somewhere in their stack, they had a cage somewhere and all that sort of stuff, there was a 100 meg uplink from a switch. So that they actually saturated that 100 meg, and whenever it did it, it was like, the servers are fine. It's like, well, that kind of makes sense considering, they can't do anything right now. So that was an interesting one. I'll just put it this way. After that, mobile got real important to everyone. Not just that, but obviously other things happened in the industry as well. An unexpected ending, I can't, there was a website, actually a network that's very popular with the kids and everything, that I can't name the name of, that I may have mentioned earlier. But they had a very popular television show about a nice Italian family. But it ran on this stack that was it was Oracle, it was like all this weird, like whatever version of Java they had was old when we got it, and we inherited the setup from a third party as we're trying to bring anything under the larger corporate banner in-house to do hosting. So it was going to be the last episode of this extremely popular television show. I think it was a Sunday night, if I recall correctly. And once a month or every 6 weeks, whatever, we had a readout of their projects going on. Maybe it had 20 things in here. And so, number 18 on that list, hey, it's the last episode of that television show going on. And they're like, are you guys doing anything special for it? It's like, well, not really. We're going to have like a little splash page or whatever on the home page, but that's about it. It's like, okay, so no big deal, because the most traffic they had ever gotten, was a drop in the bucket. And the number of servers it took to run their site at the time, you almost had like each individual user out in the world had their own server. It was like that type of thing. So like scaling it was just a real pain. And they were rewriting the site on a more modern stack and everything. But naturally, that was kind of one of those things that never got to. And besides, it's the last episode of a television show. Who's going to care? Well, it turns out this television show, and if you know which one it is, then you'll know. The screen just went black. And for, 10 to 15 seconds, then the credits rolled. And so everyone who was a big fan of the show freaked the hell out. Like, did my cable just go out? Did I miss the last, 15 seconds of this show? That can't be the way this show ends. Who would ever end a show that way? So they all decided they would go to, this, website to check it out. So surely they have something on there about this. Like I said, the website was pretty simple, but just running on an old stack, and immediately it cratered. And then everyone thought that was a conspiracy. It says, see, this is that. And so what that did was people, such as social media was then, or just kind of word of mouth, immediately began telling everyone else, dude, you got to go, what's going on? And so they all jumped on. And so the site just, kind of bounced up and down for really, it was like hours, because no one came out and said anything. There was obviously no press release because why would you on that? You know, and in their eyes, it was kind of an interesting marketing thing. Not that the site was going down, but the fact that the ending of the show was controversial. But the interesting thing about this was actually one of those, a reason called Unexpected End. This was actually one of those that whenever their contract came up, is they chose to go elsewhere. So we actually lost, this wasn't the only reason, but it's basically lost a client over that, a rather large one. Of course, they probably were going to do other things elsewhere. And that's it. Like I said, I got tons of examples. I just kind of wanted to pick a couple of good ones, a couple of bad ones out of there that went well and everything, and free to talk about anything more in depth if anyone cares. Questions?
Why don't you just use MongoDB? I heard it was a secret sauce of that thing.
Well, we were running Mongo on top of butter, and that's about what the data looked like. Yes.
What risks did you run when you made a change on a live site? You're talking about having, you're acting at scale, and for example, you couldn't change an HTTPD conf in this situation, restart Apache on all your machines when you're running your own, and
Right.
You're having lots of things going on. How would that limit you in situations?
Did everyone hear the question? Oh, he said, whenever you're operating at scale and you're under duress in some ways or whatever, how did you do things like make Apache configuration changes, et cetera? One, you didn't run Apache, but did I mention I'm speaking at Nginx Conf next month as well? But no, not. Is generally what we tried to do was things like that. The nice thing about is just test. And it turns out to be, for things like Apache and all that, we were always generally fairly conservative in our settings as well, because we just wanted the server to stop serving rather than to get slow. And obviously you couldn't always do that. So, because usually you had back pressure somewhere else in the system, was generally the way that we did it. I just put some stuff about feature flags up there. Is in those situations, we generally design the application so most of the tuning can be done in the web app, not necessarily in the web server. It was kind of a philosophical thing because we actually had, it happened once during a rather large event during the month of March, that someone bounced a React node in the middle of all of this. That did not go well. And it turns out there was a story there, but it was kind of the same thing there. That it was part of it was having that benevolent dictator there and say that I'm like the ops guy, and is someone to make that call, good or bad. Because sometimes is if I really felt like, no, dude, we've got to change max clients or we're going to go down or whatever. Says, well, you really had to be prepared to argue your case, because in a lot of ways, like if it was not in that run book, then they were very hesitant. Because that was, like I said, been agreed with by everyone in the business included. So I had to make a case, and you had to be upfront about what is the risk of doing that. And if the risk of doing that is like I do a rolling restart of X thousand Apache servers or whatever it happens to be at the time or whatever, that might take the entire site down. And then what is the risk if we don't do it? So a lot of times that's what happened. We did things like that. Obviously, rebooting React nodes is not one of the things that we would normally do. But generally, you try not to as much as possible. And like saying, one of the ways that we was putting that tooling inside of the application, because that's generally the things that we needed. I just thought of one I should have put in there. That a quick story on one of them. Turns out there's a certain load balancer vendor who's no longer in business, and I'll tell you probably why they aren't. Whenever you did HTTP 1.1 chunked encoding on the thing, it actually buffered the entire response. And it was, and we actually had this particular vendor on site. This was 2012, and we were like, what the fuck's going on? Just, once again, everything's sitting there, and servers are not busy. You look at load balancers, they're not busy. And they had really crap tools as well. But it turned out to be that they had ran out of memory, because if you think about it, if you have, several million HTTP 1.1 connections with chunked encoding turned on, because why wouldn't you do it that way, that they went down. We actually escorted them out of the building. Somewhat for their own safety, but once the problem was done, it was literally like, I don't think you should be here when the ops VP gets back. So anyway, sorry, that was one that I just thought of, an interesting anecdote. Anything else?
Over the kind of years you had these things happening at regular events, did the culture change, like kind of working with people in the business side? Did they come to understand it better?
Generally, it's actually a good question. Is yes, it did get better, because at the beginning, things like that, oh, we don't want to do caching. Once you prove to them that no, caching is not going to break your site and your users aren't going to leave you forever, then we actually, that particular site, we implemented a sane caching policy on the site just all the time or whatever. But also, it really took, usually whenever we did one of these events, either because it was a different business unit or someone we had acquired or a partnership or whatever, that first one, everyone was extremely skeptical, us of them and them of us as well. But generally, once you got one right, then, you were pretty good. One of the reasons why on that particular unexpected ending one was, like I said, there was a series of events that led up to that, that they were already distrustful of us. So I think there really is something to be said in that world about first impressions. So kind of that first event, not that you didn't want to get every event right, that first one really had to go smooth. And in a large company, like I said, I was with a company for several years, people tended to move around and have different jobs. And one of the best things that ever happened is one of the product managers from one property took VP of marketing or something job in one of the other properties. So we had acquired, and he was already quote unquote in our corner when he did that. So that's another way the culture did. But in a lot of ways, the culture got better by us actually performing and doing what we said. It's amazing how much success, does that at times. But when you got it wrong, it got, because whenever that particular client left, there were head counts on our side associated with that client. So, they had to, find something else to do, unfortunately. Most of them stayed in the company, just different departments. Anything else? Robert?
So I'm curious if you found any issues. Obviously, you have scaling issues around unplanned events, right? So like disaster happens or something.
And
what's the feedback cycle between planned events versus unplanned events? There's some technical overlap there.
yeah. One of the interesting things is what we've kind of two things on that. One, and this may be a cultural thing, is unplanned events were somewhat easier. I mean, they were obviously frantic and all of that. But say that a major superstar happened to die, and when I was on vacation once and had to end my vacation. But kind of in that case, unplanned events, it was a lot easier to say, you know what, there was kind of a drastic measures checklist. It's like you could immediately pull out the big hammer and say, well, no, we're going to pull ads or do this or whatever. So you actually, kind of the ops team had a little bit more freedom, for lack of a better word, to be able to just do things during an unplanned event. Like the site's down, you've got to get it back up, or it's about to go down. Whereas in planned events, obviously, that's the whole reason. That's how the site made money. A lot of times the unplanned events were, from a purely business standpoint, were really about brand management, and keeping a brand reputation up. And another thing is obviously all these learnings that we had. Remember I said that site, that we implemented caching on and all that sort of stuff. Then that immediately helped us, and adding feature flags around applications and everything, immediately helped us whenever we had an unplanned event on one of these other sites, because we would take that and be able to apply it, because every site kind of had an event of some type. So a site that had gone through a major planned event usually handled unplanned events much better. So, that big hammer then can be like, oh, remember that playbook that we had for the unplanned event, for the planned event, you can kind of do something like that. So that actually is a good point to bring up. Anything else?